Hey, I am super excited to have Mark Schwartz join me today. We have a pretty interesting conversation that we have planned for you today about this thing that people are reading about and they're hearing on the news called the Great Resignation. Mark and I have been talking about this and some of the challenges that I think COVID has presented for organizations as well as employees as people are evaluating what they want to be doing with the rest of their life, or at least in the short term on their career. But before we dive into that, Mark, thanks for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thrilled almost 2 years in to still be talking about COVID. Uh,
Yeah, well,
it's
I
the
mean, we're
gift
going
that
to
keeps on giving.
it
So
is the gift that keeps on giving. I feel like as we move to 22, we're just into, it's just a continuation of 2020. We're just going to be in part two or part three of it. It's crazy.
it's the worst trilogy in history. Uh, but it is interesting though, because at different points of this pandemic, we've had these really unique challenges that not just economically or scientifically we've had to address, but they've really profoundly addressed and changed our social fabric. And
Yeah.
it sort of looks like maybe we're facing that now with this great resignation, or I've heard it called the great reshuffling too.
The great reshuffling. Yeah. And, today you and I were talking about an article that just came out in the Atlantic that was talking about the possibility of it also being the great reset. So, it's interesting because I look at it from all perspectives, right? As a business owner and entrepreneur myself, you have to pay attention to these things because there are a lot of indicators that are affecting businesses of all sizes. That this could be a potential wave of the future, right? People leaving, doing things differently, maybe reassessing their work environment, the culture that they've been subjected to during this COVID shakeup, I would say, of the work environment. And then also from an employee perspective, just trying to understand what it's going to take to keep these people engaged and focused on the mission at hand and staying involved in not siphoning off the talent to go to somebody else or to go start their own thing. So, I'm kind of anxious to, dive into this topic because I think it is number one, I think there are a lot of people paying attention to it. And number two, I think that there is an opportunity for us to look at this and learn from it and maybe approach and conduct ourselves differently going forward, both as an employer and also as employees.
Absolutely. I'd say, just to give some context for anybody who maybe hasn't heard this term, what we just saw, the Labor Department released some statistics for basically the people who had voluntarily quit their jobs
Yeah.
over this last month, over October. We're about a month behind. And so we have tracked this every month. And what we saw was that in October, 4.2 million Americans left their jobs voluntarily, which
Wow.
is nearly a record. Just missed the record, which had been set in September, of
Yeah.
4.4 million. So you think about that, 8.5 million people over a 2 month period that have left their jobs, not been fired from their jobs, not been laid off, not been let go. They just left.
Yeah.
And in the summer, in August, I think we had 4.3 million. So
Really.
there's this trend of, just we're talking about just under 3% of the US labor force. And it's really, really interesting because it's created this really tight labor market right now. So
Mhm.
what we know from the statistics is that we have about 5 million more open positions than we have people looking for those. So there's this tremendous flux
Yeah.
that's going on. Even as job openings have ramped up, people are struggling to fill them. People are struggling, as you mentioned, to retain workers they have.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, maybe the most interesting thing is that we know that in a lot of these cases, at least, it seems to be workers leaving not because they have something else lined up, which would be logical
Yeah.
and is the standard predictable behavior that economists always love.
Hmm.
They're just leaving a job, trusting that they're going to find something. So
With
I
no safety
really,
net, no
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 safety net.
immediate offer on the table. Right.
Mm-mm.
It's
Right.
crazy.
Yeah.
Well,
So
and
what's going on here, Steve?
what's
What do you think?
striking to me is that how different a year makes, right? At the beginning, a year ago, during the beginning phases of COVID, everybody was concerned whether we could keep anybody employed. What was going to happen to the economy? Were jobs going to come back? We were having to supplement incomes for the layoffs that were occurring in droves. And then as things started to balance out, and corporations and companies of all sizes started to get back to work, the employees were coming back. And what you're telling me a year later is many of them aren't happy that they came back. One of the things that I noticed out of that article today was the fact that there are more companies, and it was really interesting when you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The inference that we had kind of played up was the fact that there are a lot of people that were looking for more of that home life balance, right? And a lot of them didn't want to come back to the office. And actually, today's numbers actually indicate that there's really kind of not a very big percentage of companies that have allowed their workforce to stay at home. Most organizations have kind of come back into what we would call normal, operations, right? And I think that has, a really big impact on how people are sort of approaching it, coming back in, and sort of interacting with their jobs. And at the same time, I think clearly the data points out that people are reassessing: am I coming back to the company I really want to be working for? Am I
Right.
working with the team and the organization that I really, maybe it was there for me during COVID, but maybe isn't what I want to be doing, for the next year or several years of my career.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's always hard to take something that's this complex and put an easy tag on it, but it sure seems to me that we are looking at a cultural phenomenon
Hmm.
more than an economic phenomenon. People are reacting to the climate in their workplace predominantly. And I think that it helps that they know there's a labor market out there, perhaps where they're confident they can get another
Yeah.
job. But the fact that they're not lining up those jobs first indicates to me at least that it is not purely about the economics of the situation. It's not just about the salary and trusting that I can find, I've been offered X amount more by this other company, so I'm going to make the switch. It
Yeah.
is really a quality of life issue in the sense, or maybe it's what we maybe think of it as a quality of work issue,
Sure. Sure.
right? Quality of the workplace. So, what do you think is going on that is breeding this dissatisfaction among so many employees now that they are willing to just walk away?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good question. I think there are a couple things at work. I think as an employee, you're evaluating how our organization responded and reacted during that shutdown
Yeah.
phase. And when we pushed everybody to this new work environment from working from home, how much trust was there that I was getting the job done in the absence of seeing me in the office every single day? I think how the company communicated what the protocols were if we are going back to work, and what precautions we're taking to keep people safe and healthy, what the expectations are on the vaccine, and whether, an organization of, relatively, 100 employees or more, what the policy is going to be, despite what the federal government's trying to enforce. How are we going to respond and react to that? And ultimately, how do we communicate that in a way that is respectful for all concerned, right? And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to, and it's something, you hear me talk a lot about: how strong was our connection before COVID, and how strong was our connection after, this next phase of COVID is upon us. And I think it's really causing a lot of alarms to go off, that if you had an organization that was fairly, disconnected, that only got magnified during the work from home, we'll call it a period. And that disconnection was probably amplified when you were forcing me to come back to the office. And I wanted to say, hey, I'm more productive. I've been able to do a lot more working from home without the distractions. And G boss or HR or whoever I'm communicating with, do I have the option? And the answer was no. We don't potentially trust you to get the job done like you were the last year or so. So I think there's a lot of things at play. And I do think that for an organization of any size, you really have to pay attention, right? If small business, you got to get out from behind your desk as a business leader and a manager, and start having conversations with your employees, understand what's going on in their world, how is the COVID and the pandemic in general continuing to affect them, their morale, their attitudes, their concerns. There's still a huge amount of fear in a lot of people about what this is going to do, um, whether or not the decision for us to come back in the office was premature. Was it the right decision? Getting those people to give them a voice to offer, an opportunity to have a conversation about it as opposed to be dictated to it, I think is super important. And I think really, from a larger organization, making sure that your executive team at the top levels all the way down are making sure that there is an expectation that we need to be doing things a little bit differently this time around. The indicators show us that people are dissatisfied. There's an unhappiness. So if we're seeing it, you can't turn a blind eye and say, well, that's happening over there. It's not, hopefully to my competitor, but not to us. What is happening that we're not seeing, and what do we need to do to address it if it's afoot, and how do we correct it? And that requires some proactive, very forward thinking leadership to get engaged, not only at the top level, but at every single level within their organization, in my opinion. What do you see?
Yeah, I would agree. And thinking about as a former, maybe I say recovering middle school teacher, I remember a program that we took called Capturing Kids' Hearts, which was all about building relationships with your students.
Yeah.
And the trainer talked about relationships as you have this kind of capital, right? It's kind of like a
Hmm.
bank account. You deposit things and you withdraw things. So anytime I discipline a kid, I'm withdrawing from that relationship capital.
Yep.
And the point was, if you have not been intentional about depositing so that you have a pretty good balance in that
Yeah.
account, you start to withdraw and withdraw and withdraw
And then
and
you're
get
at a
into a
deficit.
deficit.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that made so much sense to me as a teacher. I think it really makes a lot of sense in the work environment too. And I think that what we've seen in the environment that we had, especially during the height of COVID, where so much uncertainty, so much anxiety, and so much trust that was lost. And that's something that this article that you've mentioned talks about, this trust deficit. As we've seen things, in employers wondering, how do you hold employees who are remote accountable for their work?
Yep.
And this idea of monitoring their work and putting filters and spyware essentially
Hmm.
to see what they're doing, what they're visiting. I had friends who sort of were on the receiving end of that, and it was not well received. I heard just the other day that Zoom is introducing some feature that tells the organizer of a meeting when you come in, so that it records it. So if you are late to your Zoom call, now your boss is going to know. And
Mm.
I wonder if all of these things in aggregate are just withdrawing that relationship balance down to really dangerous levels. And in some organizations where they've not been proactive about building it back up, employees have just said, I've had enough. And I'm going to walk away, because even if I don't have something else lined up, I'm pretty confident that I can find something that will allow me to maintain some sort of standard of life that is comfortable for me, and emotionally I'll be better off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can imagine, having something like that either just rolled out, as an IT update for your laptop. You're there at home. Hey, we're putting some new stuff on. It's going to help us, understand what's going on, and understand our proficiency, our productivity, and whether you're really spending, the copious amounts of time on Facebook. Right. At the end of the day, without a communication path as to why those things are important. And, I think in today's world, it's when you start treating, to use sort of your analogy, right? You start treating the adults like the kids, like they are not responsible enough to make the right decisions, do the right things, and that you constantly have to have that authority figure, IT department or your manager, or, some overarching, thing that's getting ticked, whether you made the Zoom meeting or, you spent too much time on, personal call or whatever it is. The level of distrust that begins to take hold, and that festers. And I always tell people, I was on a call this morning. I was telling somebody that the The problem is that when people don't get along, or there are things that work against the trust, you develop resentment. And when you develop resentment, it's the super secret promise of revenge. I may not get you today, but I will get you tomorrow. And a lot of these, as these articles are indicating and the news reports are indicating, the employees are getting the gotchas on the way out the door. They're saying, I'm taking my knowledge, I'm taking my experience, and I am leaving. And I may not be going to greener pastures. I may just be going, out to parts unknown, but anything is better than being here right now. And that's alarming. I think, HR departments, I think business leadership, companies of any size that are starting to see that kind of, those kinds of things happening and occurring, it's an alarm bell, and it should be a big one. And it's an opportunity for us to say, what are we doing or not doing to promote, a good working environment? And I do think, and you kind of mentioned, what's happening here is I think that we are having a cultural shift. We're having an awakening, a lot of ways, about organizations operating in the same old way they've always done it. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But for most businesses, one size does not fit all. And you're finding that employees are starting to say, I have more than one option available to me now, more so than ever.
Right.
And I think at the end of the day, we're going to come to the issue is going to come to a head. And unfortunately, the power comes in the people that we depend on for our success. Organization of any size that has employees, that requires the phones to be answered, customer emails to be responded to, people to sell and promote the product and service, you depend on that, those employees to make those things happen. And in businesses of small to large size organizations, they only scale through those efforts of those people. And so when I tell leaders, you got to look at the people that you depend on for your success. Are they trusting you? Are they believing you? Do you feel like you're creating an environment that promotes open, honest communication? And are you identifying some of these red flags before they become fatal flaws and force people out the door?
Yeah, because I got to think in this environment where we know it's a really tight labor market,
Yeah.
that retention piece becomes so critical. And the numbers have always been there that it is cheaper to keep your talent or to keep your customers. We want to think about it that way too,
Yeah.
than
Sure.
it is to acquire new ones, right? The cost of
Yeah.
hiring is significant. Um, so, what can companies do to improve their retention? And before you answer that, let me say,
Yeah.
because there's another story that showed up
Yeah.
that was making me think about this. Did you hear about the CEO who fired 900 employees, 9% of his workforce, on a Zoom call?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, I'm thinking as
yeah.
as an employee, right? I'm watching that and I'm sort of thinking in my mind, okay, am I part of an organization that might do the same thing to me? Like it's
Yeah.
hard not to compare that, because you see that, and this guy's taking massive flack for it. I think he's finally admitted maybe it wasn't the best idea in the world to
Oops.
do it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, it's got kind of shades of a whole National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, like I enrolled them in the Jelly of the Month Club kind of feel. But you know, you just got to think that anybody who hears that, though, the knee jerk reaction is to say, "Could that ever happen to me?"
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so, again, throwing that back, like, yeah, what do companies need to do here to when that question is asked for their employees to immediately say, of course not. It would never happen here because that's not who we are. That's not who our leaders are.
Well, first of all, I had to look it up really quickly because I remember that, that watching that happen, and it happened on a Friday on a Zoom call. And if you are one of the unfortunate people on this Zoom
Oh my
call,
gosh.
you are unfortunately one of the 900. The company is called better.com, which I think is ironic to the nth degree. It, first and foremost, that certainly is not the way to handle those kinds of things, right? That it just blows me away that you don't have more emotional intelligence about what's going to go on. That's for your proficiency and your, let me just get everybody into the big room and just, shoot everybody at once. That just, it blows me away that a company in today's world, would do that. It just shows a total lack um, of emotional intelligence on that entire leadership team. Not to mention the CEO that did it. So, What do companies need to do? I think, we've touched on a few things. I do think that it requires that we start having some open, honest communication with our employees. We need to be willing to have some of these conversations that are going to be a little risky, right? To be honest with you, as a CEO myself of a company, you put it out there and say, hey, what would make you happy? Everybody's going to have an opinion, right? And everybody's going to have thoughts on this, but I do think that you don't just necessarily come to it with yes, no, or yes, no questions. You don't just default to the employee satisfaction surveys that we tried and true and proved to not be valid in any way, shape, or form. I think that you got to legitimately create a level of trust with your employees. And if you're an organization that didn't do it well before the COVID, situation happened, the pandemic came about, I think that you need to acknowledge that and say, look, we're trying to do better. We're trying to not be one of those statistics. We're not trying to be one of those companies that screws it up. We want and need you here. And so I think you have to be front and center and be willing to have the confidence to get up there and say, we may not have it all figured out. There may be some things that we do that maybe not everybody's going to agree with. And, I want the opportunity to at least have that conversation. So I think that's number one. I do think that you have to put some emphasis on your HR folks and your managers who are responsible for these employees. Their success depends on the people that they're responsible for, right? And so they have a very big obligation to be plugged in with their folks. And what I have found, and I've said it before, and there have been a number of studies about organizations that promote connection and employee engagement. And employee engagement is one of those overused terms. I hate to use it in the work that I do, but that's what leadership sort of defaults to. It's like, we have an engaged workforce. We do a company picnic, we do a holiday party, we get together for, once a year trivia, we're doing all those things, right? We're doing these things to make it open for everybody to engage and connect. But the reality is, you have to go to those things and actually look around. Are the same people that are working together, kind of hanging around together? Are the same groups, the same cliques happening? Are you opening that up so everybody gets to know one another? Everybody has the possibility to get to know all the various areas of their business. And that's not a once or twice or three times a year kind of thing. It's a all the time, implementation process. It's got to be part of the culture. And so I kind of laugh when somebody says, well, what do you got for me in employee engagement? It's like, well, are you looking for the shot in the arm, or are you looking for legitimate, things to do to change the culture here? Because it will not happen overnight. It will be required to do, show up and do things on regularity to show it's not a gimmick, right? Because we're all very accustomed to, oh, the CEO read the book of the month and this is what he's learned this month to do, right? I think that, along the lines of engaged, managers and HR folks, is I think you got to look at your people and say, do they have close connections to the people that they're working with? There's statistical, data that points to the fact that if you have close personal connections, friendships at work, it becomes harder for you to want to leave because that becomes kind of your second family. Let's be honest, we spend 80% of our waking hours in a corporate environment. And if we are not happy with the people that we're working with, or we feel like we're just a cog in the machine and we don't have any value, we never feel like we're able to fully be heard or contribute or to be seen in general, other than a number, well, of course, why would I not want to leave, right? So I think it's really important to understand not only from what the employee is telling you, but what you can see through the power of observation. Are they going to lunch with one another? Are they having conversations at the coffee pot or the water cooler? And I know that seems like a dated concept, but really that's where some of the best connection and bonding happens within an organization of any size. I mean, you've seen it firsthand, in our team, because you are now part of one of the organizations that, full, disclosure, one of the software companies that I own. But we talk about the football games that happened the prior weekend. We talk about where we are in our fantasy football. We talk about the latest happenings with some of the news. We talk about movies. We talk about what we're into outside of work, because that makes us human to each other. And it makes it so much easier for people to connect and engage. And And even if things don't always go well and we have to have some more tense conversations, we have that, to your point earlier, the capital built up to be able to say, hey, look, I need you to improve here. I need some time off. And, this is why. And we've got that quid pro quo kind of thing going on. And you only get there if you're intentional about it. And I just see that a lot of organizations have, as evidenced by a number of the articles and news, reports that have come out over the last several weeks, have just kind of, okay, we're kind of through this phase of COVID. Let's go back to, business as normal. And there's nothing normal about what we're all dealing with in the world right now.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the bigger point here is that, there's this expectation that somehow things are just we're going to flip the switch and things are going to get back to the way they
Yeah.
were. And at every point, we keep waiting for that. And I don't know about you, but, I look back as we approach the third year of the pandemic in
Yeah.
terms of calendar. And I think about my own reactions to it, right? So that first spring it hits and I remember thinking, naive that I was, that by summer things will be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, by Christmas things are going to be better. You know, hey, by the spring break, the following summer. Okay, well then we got the vaccine, things did start to get better, but now we've got other variants coming up. And Delta show up and spikes. We got Omicron now, and we're trying to figure out what that means. And it just really seems like it's here to stay for the foreseeable future in some form. There may be an ebb and flow to it, but we haven't been able to just turn the page on the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of, as this has been really so protracted, it was hard to connect
Yeah.
in a virtual environment.
Sure was.
And,
Yeah.
for companies and organizations that went out of, an abundance of safety to scattering their workforce back to their homes, right?
Hmm.
They lost that water cooler time. They lost that ability to really connect at a more fundamental and authentic level,
Yeah.
because what you were getting online to do was to have Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
And I know, and I was part of some of these Zoom happy hours, and they were novel and great for the first month, and then they wore pretty quickly. You're like, oh God, can't
There
do
wasn't
another one.
enough alcohol in the world to make them that much more enjoyable, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was not an analog for the real thing,
That's
is
right.
what we found out pretty quickly. So, what do companies do um, to sort of, we've had this interruption to the natural process. And so normally, it's not, hey, everybody's back from vacation and we kind of pick up where we left off. We're trying now to build something out of the ashes of what came before, with new people in a lot of cases, with still, some restrictions that we may have around, how we have some of these touch points. It's not like, even if we wanted to do it the way that we did before the pandemic, we are able to right now.
Yeah.
But what's pretty clear is that we cannot assume that everything is going to sort of function the way that it did before. So, what is it that organizations need to do to sort of get over this inertia and inject energy back in that system and start building those relationships and those connections within the workplace again, with all of these restrictions and uncertainties still out there?
Yeah, I think we have to be more proactive, like I mentioned, about getting out and getting out from behind the desk to have those conversations. I think we need to create some opportunities for people that maybe they worked together before the pandemic and then had to go virtual and now they're back together. But there's this refamiliarization that needs to occur
Yeah.
with our coworkers and our efforts to be placed there to make it easier for people to do that. And so maybe some of those efforts are, instead of the virtual happy hour, maybe it's we're bringing in company lunches, or we're hosting a virtual, not a virtual, excuse me, a in-person happy hour now, so people can just get a little more social, a little more engaged. Obviously, there's it's still a hot button issue, and it's there's some challenges there, because how much in our space do we want to be, in another person's space? And so you have to really kind of weigh that as to, the comfort level. And you only get there by asking, what are you going to be comfortable with? One of the things that we want to do is we want to come back better, and we want to come back stronger. And we want to utilize what we've experienced together to take that fear and that trepidation and turn it into something positive. And we don't know exactly what that is 100%. It's fine to acknowledge that. In fact, I'd prefer a leader to do that and say, but here are a couple of things we'd like to try. Would you be willing to do it? Not going to force you. If it's not something you're comfortable with, not something that you feel like you have to feel obligated to participate, but it's our way of trying to get us back to not what we knew or what we consider normal, but something better.
Mhm.
And by engaging and giving these opportunities to have some conversations that don't revolve the TPS report or no,
Right.
and you mentioned this and I failed to cover it earlier, but it also looks at what are the expectations now that people have come back to the office that we're putting on these folks when we saw they were just cranking work out because they were not distracted. Is the work level and expectations there commensurate with what we have now, right? Are we expecting, that same level, high level output when, now all these different influences of being back in the office, these distractions, these challenges to our productivity, are we having good conversations about that? And I think that it's got to be measured. I think it's got to be at the end of the day, you've got to look at what's right for your organization, but you can't just ignore it and you can't just expect things to go back to normal. And I think that the more that you can have and create opportunities to have these conversations, to ask people to open up, that could be a corporate, I know these things are also get a kind of an eye roll, but these town halls that, some of these leaders are doing, some of the best input comes from those environments where, hey, there's a little bit of social proofing when I'm around, 300 of my other colleagues or 20 of my other colleagues. And I'm saying, look, here's something I'm really scared about. During the pandemic, I encouraged all my executive clients that I was working with, coached them through how to engage with employees by asking, "Hey, what did you learn through this process? What scared you? What still scares you? And what can we do to help there?" And being authentic and being very intentional about that from the leadership perspective, from the very top all the way down to the bottom, I think is very important. And I think if you want to really utilize and have something positive come out of this pandemic experience, it's an opportunity to create a completely new culture, a completely new way that we operate, how we treat one another, how we respect and honor one another, and potentially how we have potentially differentiated ourselves as employees during this very difficult time to maybe get some exposure for other areas of the business that we can contribute. All of these are potential areas worth exploring. But if we just go back to same old, it'll never improve. And I do think that you at some juncture will find an avenue where people will start leaving, and it doesn't matter how big or small your company is, it'll just happen. Some of that is natural, some of it is expected. What you really want to do is you just want to make sure that you're not part of the statistic where people are leaving in droves.
Yeah, I think that it's for organizations the ability to balance these sort of opposing forces of the uncertainty of the environment that we're in,
Yeah,
which is still very much in play, with the need for continuity with your employees, right?
yeah, yeah,
And we need to. You talk about flexibility, and I completely agree. You've got to be flexible to respond to changing conditions. I would say what you can be consistent about and have to be consistent about are what are the values that we're going to have as a company, as an organization, about how we treat each other, whether that's across horizontal relationships or vertical relationships.
yeah. I
That's what
agree.
culture is really based on, and I think that that's where the companies that are going to come out of this stronger are the ones that you know they engage in that sort of self-reflection and understand, like you said, here's what we've learned from this, and this is how maybe it has changed our organizational DNA even. But here are the things that as a result of what we've gone through, the shared experience that we're going to really cling tightly to and our values. And if we know what we hold tight, we know what we can be looser about, right?
Yep.
And maybe it's not about, making sure that everybody is in their cubicle at from 8 to 5 in front of the computer. We can make accommodations as we need to if we have a value that informs that, and that's the consistency and the continuity that people may be looking for a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if you're an organization that has, struggled with the trust factor with your employees, then you need some training on how to get over that. And I think you
Yeah,
need to take steps to stop utilizing that as the only barometer by which you judge. And I think it's important that you find an avenue to overcome that and start rebuilding that brand of trust. I think it's possible. I think people are, they vote with their time and their physical presence to contribute to your business. You vote with your paycheck, the paycheck that you afford them, the opportunity to have that job. But it is definitely a two-way street. There is a partnership there, and you just need to make sure that you're making it safe, open, and honest for that partnership to not only take what we've experienced, but to grow from here. And I think
right.
that's kind of key. I will say, for the larger organizations, for those leaders that might tune into this, for whatever you do, and this comes from personal experience. I have a friend that works at a major company that shall remain nameless because I don't want to, screw myself out of ever speaking to them. But they announced this past week that they were going to stay virtual through, the end of the year. There was some expectation that they might go back before Christmas and in early January, and they've basically put it on hold for the first quarter because of the variant, and want to wait and take a wait and see. And yet I have a buddy who said it was so great to go home, and or flip. I mean, they were still at home, excuse me, but he flipped on the television at the end of the day to watch the evening news to learn what his corporation was planning on
No.
doing for how they were going to handle first quarter. That's kind of what we're talking about here,
Well,
right?
it's that anxiety piece,
It
right?
is.
It's that, I didn't see it coming, so I'm blindsided by it. And what we know, I'm going to throw out a historical anecdote because I'm a history geek.
Yep.
There was a study that was done of mutinies in the British Navy in the late 1800s or late 1700s, early 1800s. So, the mutiny of the Bounty, right? The
Yep.
Bounty was one of them. And this psychologist did the study and really wanted to try to figure out what caused crews to mutiny. And of course, logically, we would say, well, it was being treated poorly. As it turns out, that wasn't the reason.
No.
It was the uncertainty, the anxiety that was created by leaders who would do radically different things that were unpredictable.
Hmm.
So the captains who, one day they were your best friend, and the next day they were flogging the last man off the yardarm, right?
Yeah.
Like that was what created this state of psychological instability, and eventually the crew breaks.
Yep.
And there were plenty of ships where the captains were arguably way, way stricter that never mutinied because the crew knew what to expect.
Sure.
So, coming back to that idea of what makes a workforce want to leave, if I don't know what's going on, if I don't know what my company values are, or they say these are the values, but they don't act in accordance with them, if the communication is all out of left field, so I'm hearing, from the media things that I should have heard from my supervisor, at some point you got to figure that takes a toll. And
It
given
does.
the psychological toll that we've all suffered under for the last now almost 2 years with COVID, our reserves are drained. That we're sort of damaged creatures, a lot of us right
Sure.
now. And I think
Absolutely.
employers, if they're not taking that into account, again, like we are talking about, if you're trying to run things the way that you did before COVID, it's not going to work.
No, not it's not, and I do think that, we have one unifying experience that we all have gone through together, which is this situation with the pandemic. Some of us handled it fine, some of us are really struggling with it. Some of us have even greater fears about what the future holds, what it's going to do to our business, whether it's going to impact our ability to, sustain the operation. And I can't, be without a paycheck, or I can't be without making that house payment. All of these things are important, valuable perspectives that I think companies need to recognize and start having those conversations and making it okay to have it. And not just with, because I'm pulling you in and I want to have that one-on-one meeting. And now, oh my God, they're doing it to everybody, right? Maybe they're trying to figure out who's going to crack.
Right.
I don't know. but encourage it between one another out there in the cubicle jungle, your colleagues, your coworkers, your partners, even dare I say, your customers, so that we have these conversations so that people are starting to recognize that this is a human issue. And it's the way to deal with it and the way to understand it is to have human to human conversation. And I just can't say it enough that I see and have had more than enough examples thrown up to me in the last few months about companies that have just would like to pretend that this thing is not going on still, even though we're back and we're doing our day to day work, but they're not paying attention. And I think with these reports, like you said, with the job reports being what they are, I think there's a huge indication that there is a big iceberg headed our way. And it's an opportunity for us to avoid it by being proactive and being attuned to what's happening and maybe doing some, sort of self analysis about what I need to do as a better leader. And, for those of you that are employees, what can I be to be a better employee, a better
Right.
contributor? And if your organizations are not starting these conversations, ask them if they'd be willing to let you start those conversations, have those conversations. You'll be surprised. They will be open to it because I think they're, they everybody needs somebody to start the momentum, right? And that ripple that you create in terms of that action you take could make a huge difference for everybody at the company.
Yeah, I think no one's been through in our lifetime anything remotely like this.
No.
So nobody has that experience to draw on about how we navigate this successfully.
Yep.
And those people who figure it out and are willing to step up, willing to try some things, and find a better path. I think that there's tremendous opportunity there. You said it earlier. This is also the Great Reset, and so there are going to be some companies out there, I think, who put it all together and honestly emerge stronger because they've realized this is what makes us unique. This is what holds us together. This is what creates a community, not just among our internal stakeholders, but our customers as well.
Yep. Well said. Well said. And I will say the great reset question or statement that a leader and an organization and anybody can actually say is thank you for sticking with us.
Yeah,
Thank you for going through what you've gone through over the course of the last year. Thank you for still being here. Thank you for contributing, showing up, figuring out, as we figure out what we're doing and where we need to make the shifts that you kind of go with the flow. But, those leaders that are out there that may hear this, how many times this week did you say, thank you for doing a good job? Thank you for, participating in this meeting. Thank you for being here. Thank you for, you know, being flexible enough to allow us to figure this out as we're going forward. Because as you said, there is zero playbook on
right,
this process. And the you start the battle from here, build
right.
those relationships, build those connections, have those open, honest conversations. And if you're really struggling with it, hey, contact me. I've got some ideas, some thoughts. Like to know where your particular challenges are. I'm really, really good at those kinds of things, being able to sort of help you maybe see some areas maybe that you could approach in terms of your communication or some ideas and strategies that you could implement that could start rebuilding some of those ties to rebuild that trust and establish those lines of communication. So I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But Mark, this has been a great conversation. I mean, I think we could talk about this some more. And as more of this comes about, I think over the coming months, it's going to be real interesting to see as we go into the new year how how this tide continues or
Yeah.
if it changes.
I'd love to hear from anyone who is listening to this or watching this who has not just questions, but if their experience is one of those positive ones, let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want to know if somehow you've emerged from this, at least to this point, having done something that you didn't expect that's positive maybe, and what those positive lessons might be for others. So, but yeah, there's plenty more to talk about. Thanks for making the time to do it today.
Yeah, thanks
Always
for.
enjoy it.
Yeah, me too. We will be. We're gonna have to do some more of these, and there's other topics that you and I like to riff on, and so this may become a recurring theme for us. I
Yeah,
sure enjoy learning from you because you're one of the smartest guys I know. You're paying attention and watching a lot that's happening out there. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to work with you. So thanks for being a part of the team.
I appreciate that very much. And,
All right.
as an educator, great feedback, very specific.
Woohoo. All right. Sweet. All right, man. Ripple on.
Ripple on.